This is not real poetry, because in the first 5 words, I have already broken the Khoisan rule, that one must never write poetry about poetry. The same logic that makes Tom Stoppard a hack, since he writes plays about plays. This is not real poetry, because it has no intended rhythm or meter. It is just an anarchy of chopped up prose with line breaks not random enough to be called art. Best to chuck it down a literary memory hole with William Carlos Williams and his breakfast plots. This is not real poetry because it is devoid of concrete sensory imagery, and poetry is worthless without concrete sensory imagery. Oh, so the real poets tell me. The argument I hear tends to go like this. Poetry is about images and how you sense stuff and how you make the reader see and smell and feel the same things, but in sort of a poetic way with words, okay? And if you can't do that, then you're stupid and boring and you shouldn't write anything ever. Stupid. No way I can win that debate.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter-century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 238 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Jeff Cottrill. Jeff Cottrill is a fiction writer, poet, journalist, and spoken word artist based in Toronto, Canada. He is headlined in countless literary series throughout Canada, the UK, the US, France, and Ireland over the last 20 years. His performance style is influenced by slam conventions, but subverts them with wit, ironic humor, and a satirical tone. His poem, This Is Not Real Poetry, is currently nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and his first novel, Hate Story, is coming soon in 2022 from Dragonfly Publishing. We talk about his spoken word art, his writing, and his forthcoming book, and that's coming up later in this episode. First, let's hear a word from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. Findaway Voices has a merchandising opportunity for authors. It's one of the many things they offer authors, but I'm just going to read to you from this recently posted and emailed out to Findaway authors. Authors and right holders have a new opportunity to reach more audiobook listeners. The merchandising team at Findaway Voices is looking for discounted audiobooks to pitch to our retailers. All genres are accepted, but we are especially interested in titles for the following themes. Spring-themed titles. April is Poetry Month, just like our guest from this episode. May is Mental Health Month. June is Pride Month. This promotional opportunity will also include general submissions for June Audiobook Month. Ideally, titles should be discounted at least 50% off the current retail list price. Please do not adjust your price on the Findaway Voices dashboard. All pricing modifications will be handled on the back end by the Findaway merchandising team. Discounts will apply from April 1st through June 30th, unless data parameters are set otherwise in the submission form. Feel free to nominate as many titles as you like. Titles that are accepted will receive notice of which retailers and any other pertinent details. So, to participate, please submit your titles. There's a link. There'll be a link in the show notes at starkreflections.ca for this episode, and they want them submitted before 11:49 Eastern Standard Time, Tuesday, March 15th, 2022. So you have until the Ides of March to get that in if you're a Findaway Voices author. If you're not a Findaway Voices author and you're looking to see how you can leverage Findaway Voices as an author and master your audiobook author destiny, you can check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. All right, so the sponsor for the podcast helps support the hosting fees for the show, but your patronage helps support my time in producing this weekly podcast. And I would like to welcome back patron Tessa Smith McGovern, to the family of awesome patrons who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections. Welcome back, Tessa. Great to have you back on board. And just a reminder, you can come and go as you guys please. Becoming a patron gives you full access to all of the materials there. So even if you just wanted to temporarily become a patron, I'm also going to make it a little bit easier for people to buy me a coffee, because I understand, the monthly subscription of a patron, even if it's $1 a month, it adds up. But if you just wanted to throw $1 or $2 my way, I will add a link in the show notes over to Buy Me a Coffee. So a special thank you to all those who have bought me coffee and beers, and special thank you to all my patrons who support my podcast. More content coming for you. And I realized I didn't yet do the draw. Shame on me. I will do the draw shortly after I finish getting this episode produced, because the drawing itself takes quite a bit of time to probably export everyone to a list and then anonymize it and then do random number generation and all that stuff. So I will let you know who's going to win Angeline Trevina's book on world building, the second volume from the patrons, and that'll be coming up probably in next episode. In the meantime, thank you to all my patrons. And now, on to comments. Just a couple of comments that I'm going to share this time around, just because it's been a while, and my apologies for people who have commented and I haven't shared. But just recently on Twitter, Edwin Downward shared a response to my last episode when I was talking about food, and he said, for an alternative look at the question of historical food, you can also look at What Kings Ate and Wizards Drank by Krista D. Ball at KristaDB1 on Twitter. I know from her Twitter feed that she actually made many, if not all, of the recipes as she wrote it. Now that is kind of awesome. And I know Krista, she is an awesome fellow Canadian author. So thank you, Edwin, for that reminder of that. And also on both Twitter as well as a comment at starkreflections.ca, I heard from Kevin Partner, who said, in relation to episode 236 with Angeline Trevina, again, response to that same episode, fantastic interview. Could have listened to you chatting for hours. I'm also a pantser writing post-apoc. All I know when I start a series is what caused the world to end, which happens in chapter 1. My preparation is to build a cast of characters, then set them loose in the rubble. Thank you so much for the tweet and the comment over at starkreflections.ca, Kevin. I love that. Let them loose in the rubble. That's kind of a cool thing, because that's kind of what we do. We set our characters loose, but in post-apoc, you're letting them loose in the rubble. So thank you for your comments. If you feel that you would like to comment, you can comment over at Twitter. I'm at Mark Leslie, or you can leave a comment for any episode over at starkreflections.ca. And now for a very brief personal update. So, it's crunch time for this author. I've got so many projects in the works right now as an author, on the consulting I do, everything. So this week, I'm recording this on Thursday, March 3rd, 2022. And as of March 1st, 2022, Smashwords and Draft to Digital became the new, larger Draft to Digital, with some really great strategies and chat sessions. It was so great for me. I had a chance for almost 2 hours to catch up with Mark Coker and say, wow, we finally get to work together as opposed to alongside one another. So that's really great. He is a wonderful guy. We had some great discussions about possibilities that are just going to be beneficial for indie authors. So that's obviously been taking up a lot of my time. But in terms of my early morning writing hours and late night and weekends writing hours, Julie Strauss and I have made some headway on A Lover's Moon. We changed the cover. We had a new cover designed. I can't remember if I talked about that last week or not. But it didn't look enough like Gale. So we had one go back. But Julie actually said something in a text message to me. Where I said, well, the woman on the cover doesn't really look a lot like Gail. Yeah, she has green eyes, which Gail has, but she has blonde hair and she's kind of like too young, not the age that I sort of described Gail as. And Julie said, yeah, that's not how I pictured her at all. And then she sent me a picture of Rachel Weisz, the actress, and she said, like her, beautiful, but she would knife you if you looked at her the wrong way, or you crossed the line or something, something along those lines. And I said, that's it exactly, because Rachel is gorgeous. But again, even the picture Julie sent, was just the look on her face was just like she was sort of half smiling, but she kind of had that serious look. So we spent some time looking at some, I think it was Dreamscape, not Dreamscape, one of the platforms that I have licensing, where I license images from, and Dreamstime, I think it was, and I looked at a few different, beautiful, probably in their 30s brunettes who kind of looked a little bit like Rachel, and they sort of had that, very, very attractive, but also that serious look that looked like they could knife you. And we found one. So I had one sort of change her eye color to green and change the shirt she was wearing to black, because that's more Gale. And we had one redo the cover and put her on the cover, redid sort of the backdrop for New York City. And we love the cover. But what I love even more is we did the, from Gwen Hayes, the Romancing the Beat. So Julie did the majority of the work on that outline, really nailed some great conflict for Michael and Gale as we tell their origin story, their meet cute. And then I set about chapter 1 and flipped it over to Julie, and she's going to send back chapter 2, and then I'm going to write chapter 3, and we're going to just keep alternating like that. And I'm so thrilled about that project. So that's been going on. I also finally turned in my rewrites and my additions to Accounting for Authors back to D.F. Hart. And she's already gone through that in just the 24 hours since I sent it to her, and added some things, and we're sending that off to at least one or two sort of early readers before we do some tweaks. We kind of edit each other's notes, and then we'll have the final proofread edit being done on that one, because that's going live later in March, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes, of course. On top of that, I'm working with Sarah Cadies, and she's got the third book in her echo thriller, romantic thriller series, the Hearthstone series, and she's going to be getting me that manuscript, in which case I will be doing the final edit. So she actually has a real awesome editor, Adrian Kerr, amazing editor, and her and Adrian have done the back and forth. So I'm sort of like the final line edit. I'm not changing anything developmentally. I think even in the edits that I did on the last manuscript, it was very minimal. Just a few things that I thought were a little bit confusing, but Adrian usually catches like 98% of those things, and she works well with Sarah on those. So I'm just kind of doing the final formatting and the final sort of line edit on that, so we can get that off. And that one's coming out in the spring as well, so that one we want to have out so I can get ARC copies to reviewers early. So there are other projects that I started working on, but I haven't even been able to get into them. The biggest news I'm so thrilled about, I just learned yesterday that I got another Chirp deal. So in April, between April 8th and May 6th, my birthday, I have Fear and Longing in Los Angeles on Chirp for 99 cents. I think I made, $1,200 US dollars in January off of the sales of the Canadian Werewolf series. And what I did is I dropped the price of the other books. I didn't even have Fright Night's Big City out in audio until the very tail end of that, like the last few days. So this will be awesome, because what I did in support of it is I scheduled Chirp price drops. So Canadian Werewolf's going to drop to 99 cents as well, book 1 in the series. And so is Stowaway, which is the novella, book 1.5. Book 2, Fear and Longing in Los Angeles, is the featured deal on Chirp. And then Fright Night's Big City, I think I made it $1.99. I didn't want to bring it all the way down. So, but again, it's still, down from the regular $14.99 price. So it's a pretty good deal. And I know I'm going to do well with that, because I did really, really well on the other one. I think Canadian Werewolf in New York has well over 100 ratings and reviews on Chirp, and all of the books have ratings and reviews. Obviously, Canadian Werewolf sold the most because that was the featured one, but I am so thrilled that I have that Chirp deal. So I've got that coming up. Some other writing and box set stuff, but that's enough out of me, right? That's enough. That's enough out of you, Mark. Why don't we get on to the main content for this episode, which is this wonderful conversation that I got to have recently with Jeff Cottrill. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thanks for having me here, Mark.
I'm so thrilled to get to talk to you. So I first want to kind of learn a little bit about, you've done, fiction writing, poetry, journalism, novelist, but also a spoken word artist, which I'm really curious to learn more about. What sparked that creativity, that passion for the written word for you?
Oh, I've been writing since grade school, probably as early as grade 1 or 2. I would write stories and silly poems. And a lot of my stories back then, I think they were just blatant rip-offs of Wayne and Schuster sketches or other stuff, or cartoons, like Warner Brothers cartoons I'd seen on TV. I just blatantly ripped them off, but I'd write them in my own voice too, kind of.
Okay, all right.
And so I've always had an interest in, writing stories and poems. And that became more serious, I think, in late high school. I had a couple of English and writer's craft teachers who were very encouraging. So that became more serious as I got into university, and I co-majored in creative writing in university, but it was a terrible program, and they wanted everybody to do like the same minimalist canlit style, and they just hated me. And that discouraged me for years. And then spoken word, I kind of stumbled into accidentally. I started going out to open mics, just reading bits of my stories and whatnot. And I saw people were doing very interesting things. It was sort of poetry and not poetry at the same time. And, but they just kind of did it in their own performance style. And this was before slam came to Toronto, pretty much. There was hardly any slam at the time.
Right.
It was just like regular poetry open mics, and some people were doing a more of spoken word kind of style with that. And I liked that. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to do that my way, though. So I kind of developed my own style that was kind of a mix. It had elements of poetry, but also elements of comedy and theater and storytelling. And some people had a problem with it. Some people still have a little bit of a problem with it, but other people seemed to like it, and I enjoyed it, and I just kept on doing it like that.
Wow. I think I'm obligated, as you and I are both Canadian, I'm obligated to share with my audience who are not from Canada and may not be as familiar with this Wayne and Schuster comedy duo that you mentioned, right? Like, does that, I mean, I'm not even sure how well known they are outside of Canada. Like,
I know they were broadcast internationally, and of course they were on the Ed Sullivan Show. Of course they knew them, so they knew them in the
of course,
US.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
so
Ed Sullivan, they're like in the 60s and early 70s, I think.
right.
So
Yeah.
Americans knew them pretty well back then.
Oh,
But
that's
mostly
good.
they were a Canadian phenomenon.
Okay, so when you were talking about, like, when you were writing stuff like that in high school, you said like funny poetry you talked about?
Oh
Like
yeah. I don't know. I've
limericks? What was this?
always swerved towards the silly and or very satirical. It's just my nature, and I don't know why that is. Maybe I'm just very angry, or maybe I just like the silly. But there's always a kind of a Python influence happening there, or a Warner Brothers cartoon influence happening that
Right.
just creeps into my work whether I want it or not.
And then when you talked about going to university and doing the creative writing course, and then just realizing they're kind of stifling what you wanted to do, right?
Oh, on purpose. I think they were doing it on purpose. They were trying to turn everybody into second-rate Michael Ondaatjes or second-rate Hemingways, when they should have been trying to make everybody a first-rate, themselves. That's what they should have been doing. And there was a lot of bullying, because they were critique workshops, the bad kind of critique workshops, where the students are just encouraged to battle each other and fight each other and knock each other down, when they're supposed to be trying to help each other get better by saying, well, this is not this is why it sucks, but this is how you do it better. That's what it should be. So I've since taken better workshops that were more that kind of thing. But I mean, the really bad workshops can be traumatizing, and it can hurt your confidence for years.
Right. Yeah. It always boggles my mind. I'm going to make myself feel better as a writer by tearing you a new one in my critique, because I'm going to show you how smart I am by showing you how bad your writing is. Like,
Exactly.
What's that all about?
That just seemed to be the attitude with a lot of people in this program.
Wow.
And it just, no matter how talented or not talented you are, it just suggests a serious insecurity, a serious lack of self-esteem, that you feel you have to do that instead of winning out just by being a good writer. Some people do both, strangely enough. They're good writers, but they also like to put people down, and I don't know where that comes from.
Strange. So you talked a little bit about what a spoken word artist is, and slam poetry, and open mic night. So I always the dichotomy of the introverted writer versus the a stand-up comedian. That your role is to be in front of people with a mic, right? Like you have
Right.
to have the guts. How do we deal with the fact that writers are often introverted, and yet here you are, you're going to perform, whether it's poetry or some other spoken word art, very much in a dramatic sense. It's not just a reading, right? It's not like, hey, you just stand there and read. How did you get into that? Really, I'm just
Well,
curious.
it was partly studying acting in high school, and I wasn't that good at it, or I guess I just didn't have a lot of confidence at the time, and I auditioned for stuff but hardly ever got in. So I had that experience and enjoyment of it, and I brought that to live readings where you have the kind of introverted writers who go up and they read their poetry in a voice like this, and they have to go up like this at every line. And I just that's one of the reasons a lot of people hate poetry, or they think they hate poetry, at least because of that. So I mean, the thing with is to bring some kind of energy and life into it. And I mean, there are also the people who bring too much energy into it because they shout every line at the same thing, and they don't understand how dynamics work. Sometimes there are parts to go loud, and sometimes there are times to go subtle, and in between. And that for me is the thing for spoken word and also stand-up comedy and other performance things. You have to have a range of dynamics to make it work right. But yeah, that's kind of how I worked it.
Is it possible with spoken word that you have written text that you're basing it on? Is it possible that in different crowds you're going to play off the crowd differently?
Yeah, you kind of have to feel the room. I hate that phrase, but you do kind of have to feel the room sometimes. And there are times when I've done performance material in front of more literary audiences and it doesn't go over. And I
Right.
feel like David Brent. Do you know the episode of The Office where David Brent is giving the seminar and he just turns it into a big self-help thing? And is like, well, you can be the best. And he starts lip syncing Tina Turner and they're all like embarrassed. I sometimes wonder if I'm coming off like that when I do performance material before a more literary audience and it's not going over. So there is an extent where you have to read the room and see how it's going to work. And if it looks like a really energetic audience, then I'll bring out something loud and shouty. Or if it's more of a literary audience, I'll bring something that's a little more subdued but still funny or still entertaining in some way.
Right.
And just not to make too big a fool of myself. Just
I
the
had
right amount, I guess.
Yeah, the right amount. I had a flashback when you were talking about that scene from The Office.
Yeah.
The Bugs Bunny, when he's there for the doctors, there's the medical experiment where they're going to swap out his brain, and he starts performing, and the doctors are just staring at him like blankly.
Oh yes, that's right. I remember that one. Yeah.
So your poem, this is not real poetry, which I want to talk about the ironic title. That was it was published by Brownstone Poets Anthology.
That's right.
And it is nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Congratulations for one.
Thank you.
When do you find out?
I got an email from the editor of the anthology. Now, Brownstone Poets, they're based in Brooklyn, New York, and I've been to their real life show once, actually, and that was 10 years ago. And then when the pandemic happened, the series and a lot of others went on Zoom, so I started becoming a semi-regular on the Zoom series, and the host remembered me from 10 years before. I was really shocked. I must have been memorable in some way, but the host remembered me. So anyway, so I submitted to their anthology, and the way I understand that the pushcart thing works is if you're an editor of an independent anthology or journal or whatever, you can submit your 6 favorites or just 6 you think are good for the nomination. So that's how I got it, and that's my understanding of how it works.
So you're in Canada. Are you in the Toronto area? Is that where?
That's right. I'm in East Toronto.
And so obviously 10 years ago you got a chance to experience the Brownstone poetry in person, and yet ironically with the pandemic you had an opportunity to really connect with those folks because it was virtual, because you didn't have to be in Manhattan to do this, right?
Exactly. And that is, I actually wrote an article about this for Digital Journal back in 2020 about the Zoom poetry community, that this impromptu community that's built up as kind of a silver lining to the pandemic and whatnot, is it's allowed me to reconnect with people in the UK and the US that I've performed with before, and even Paris. But it's also taken me to new US cities. It's taken me to Asia and Australia, and I've made all these new friends and contacts. And I've been able to keep my spoken word career going internationally by doing these Zoom gigs and open mics and whatnot, and making new contacts. And my novel launch coming up on March 19, I have an international lineup of guest readers and performers, 3 of whom are from Toronto. They're people I know personally, but the rest, I just wanted to take advantage of Zoom and have this international community, showcase that. I thought that would be a great idea.
Oh man, I love that. Yeah, I want to talk about your forthcoming novel. It's coming up very, very soon. But before then, I'm curious, because this is an award-nominated poem, and I love the way that you came together with this virtual community. First question is that article still available? Can I include a link to that in the show notes? For
the Zoom Poets one. Yes, it's on Digital Journal. I could send you a link if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm sure for some of my listeners who would just want to check it out.
I'm sure it's easy to find too, like on Google or something. Just Google, I guess, Digital Journal Zoom Poets or something. It's called Meet the Zoom Poets. Meet the Zoom Poets.
Okay, we'll take a look for that. Would you be able to entertain us with maybe a short excerpt from This Is Not Real Poetry? But first, before we do that, This Is Not Real Poetry. Let's talk about the irony of that title.
Oh, okay. Well, the poem was inspired by a friend of mine in Paris. I featured in her series back in 2015, and we were debating, like, before the show about what real poetry is, because like she has kind of, I guess, traditionalist ideas about what poetry is. Right. And so I did my set, and she came up to me after and says, "Well, that was great. I liked that. I really, really liked that." And I said, "Did you think it was real poetry?" And she said, "No." So I got the idea for this poem from that.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for the setup. Now we get to hear an excerpt from that.
Okay. This is not real poetry, because in the first 5 words, I have already broken the Khoisan rule that one must never write poetry about poetry. The same logic that makes Tom Stoppard a hack, since he writes plays about plays. This is not real poetry, because it has no intended rhythm or meter. It is just an anarchy of chopped up prose with line breaks not random enough to be called art. Best to chuck it down a literary memory hole with William Carlos Williams and his breakfast plums. This is not real poetry, because it is devoid of concrete sensory imagery, and poetry is worthless without concrete sensory imagery. Oh, so the real poets tell me. The argument I hear tends to go like this. Poetry is about like images and like how you sense stuff and how you like make the reader see and smell and feel the same things, but in sort of a poetic way with words, okay? And if like you can't do that, then you're stupid and boring and you shouldn't write anything ever. Stupid. No way I can win that debate. So that's from This Is Not Real Poetry.
And it goes on from there.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that. Thank you so much for that wonderful teaser. So I love this. And so this book that's coming out on March 19th, 2022, which is called Hate Story. Mm-hmm. I have to preface this with a couple things. It's been described as kind of like a parody of Citizen Kane and other noir films. It has themes of hatred, bullying, and abuse. And I have to read, before we talk about it, this quote from Giles Blunt, Canadian best-selling author of the John Cardinal mysteries. I'm just going to read this quote about it. From Twitterized mobthink to Facebook fact hacking to knuckle-dragging attacks on science, our current reality, online or off, presents formidable problems for the satirist. Cottrill takes up that challenge and runs with it, skewering journalists, online vigilantes, and cyberbullies with undisguised glee. Wow, that's quite the quote. Congrats on getting that. So,
thank you.
Hate Story, coming out March 19th, 2022. Tell us a little bit about that novel.
All right. Well, it's what it really is. It's a mix of satire and mystery. And you mentioned the Citizen Kane comparison, is because the plot structure is kind of a loose parody of Citizen Kane. Because if you remember the movie, there's a reporter trying to find out the secret of a man's life. Well, this is the same idea, except in the case of Hate Story, the man is a big loser that everybody hates, and there's a literal riot at his funeral.
Oh,
Yes. So
dark humor, I'm guessing.
oh yeah, oh yeah. I was probably subconsciously thinking of the movie Charade, where there's kind of a nasty funeral in that. But so there's a riot at his funeral, and it turns out that's because of this really, really dark online community that's been sullying Paul's name for like literally years. So the protagonist, Jackie, is this wannabe film critic. Well, she writes movie reviews for this really crappy website for almost no pay. And her editor asks her to find out about this and do a story about it. So she interviews people who, like, similar to Citizen Kane, like she interviews people who knows Paul, and they all turn out to be really, really eccentric. And she learns more about them than about Paul. Right. And then there are some really nasty twists in the story, like both about Paul and about her. And I don't want to give it away. But basically, overall, it's a satire of online shaming. It's what some people call cancel culture, except I try to avoid that phrase now because it's become so trite and overused and misused and all that. But so I say online shaming or socially acceptable cyberbullying is another way to put it.
Socially acceptable cyberbullying. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So what makes some bullying acceptable and other ones not?
Oh, when a person says something politically incorrect or makes a bad joke or something, or just accidentally says something really stupid and wrong, and they're not necessarily a bad person, but Twitter doesn't care. Twitter just like shames and ruins their lives, just like with just the shaming and shit posting and all that stuff. And that's something that happens now and then. And I suppose some people deserve it. I don't care so much about the celebrities. Like when it happens to celebrities and politicians, I don't care as much because, they've already got their money and whatnot. But when it happens to an ordinary person, that's when it makes me mad. And I talk to people about this and they say, so it's accountability, Jeff. But, to me, that's accountability means you've done something really, really, really bad and harmful instead of saying something stupid. The most famous example is Justine Sacco. You might have heard that. She had the AIDS joke on Twitter, and her life was ruined literally during a plane ride. Like while she was on the plane after tweeting that bad joke, everybody on Twitter had the hashtag "Has Justine landed yet?" and they were calling her racist. And so she got off the plane somewhere in Africa and found out she no longer had a job. She no longer had friends. Her life was over pretty much. And that's a very well-known example, but it's happened in other ways too, in other places. Right. And
and that's really powerful because what you have is, so you have this funeral. It opens up, yes, so the Citizen Kane, yes, the person's dead already, and we're going to do the investigation of their life. And so does the fight happen because of infighting in this sort of bullying community? Like, and why would they be at this person's funeral? Just to gloat? Like, or do we learn that in the book?
They're not attendees. Like, there are only 6 attendees.
Oh, okay.
There's only 6 actual attendees at the funeral. So there's Paul Shortich is the character, and his parents are 2 of the attendees, and people who knew him. And is that right? 6? Something like that. Anyway, yeah. And the riot comes from protesters at the funeral. Some of them are members of this online community, and some of them, how these things spread, and it kind of created like a real life mob instead of just an online mob.
We haven't seen anything like that in Canada recently, where there was all kinds of activity outside with people.
Nothing in Ottawa, nothing in Ottawa, nothing's happening, not looking here, and it's funny because, the thing that comes to mind now is also the January 6th, the Capitol riot, which, the weird thing is I had this idea back in 2007 or 2008. So I've had this idea long before. Yeah. And I started writing the book more than a year before the January 6th thing happened. No, wait a minute. I think more than 2 years, actually. I started writing it in early 2019.
Wow. Because I think I read something that this was book was 10 years in the making, right?
Something like that. Well, again, I first had the idea in 2007 or 2008 or so,
Okay.
and I started writing it then. But it was just a really skeletal idea, like the Citizen Kane parody,
Right.
where the riot at the funeral happens, and then the investigator has to find out why everybody hates this person.
Right.
But I tried writing it back then, and I didn't have a lot of confidence in my fiction writing ability back then. So, and it had this really pretentious sounding title, Interred with Their Bones, which I took from Shakespeare. And when you read, I kept it as the epigraph, so you'll understand how it relates if you see the book and you see the epigraph. But so I just it was an unfinished project. And then, I started writing fiction seriously again about 4 or 5 years ago, and the idea came back to me, but I thought I can also turn this into a satire of cancel culture or online shaming or whatever you want to call it, because there's the same thing about one really hated person like being hated and abused by this mob, but I can turn it into an online satire. So that's when it seemed to gel a lot better there.
Right. And then, so what was the process then of Dragonfly Publishing as your publisher for this? What was the process of finding them and all of that?
I kind of lucked out there because I spent almost a year looking for a publisher and or agent. Like first I tried agents and I didn't really expect to because they'd never heard of me. But then with independent publishers, I was just everybody I could find that was somehow open to either satire or mystery or both. And it was just a struggle because, either I would get no response or they'd say, not for me, or a couple that were like, well, I find the lead character so unlikable and the story isn't realistic enough, and other stuff that had nothing to do with how good or bad the book was. It's just like, I guess that's what they consider marketable now. Like your character has to be Nancy Drew likable or nothing. That's all it is. So, but I lucked out with Dragonfly because I was like this close to self-publishing on Amazon when my Australian friend Skylar, she had already read an earlier draft of the book and loved it. She told me, well, my new publisher is really, really keen to read this book. I've been telling her about it. So I said, well, the timing's a bit odd, but sure, yeah, pass it on to her. And that's Lisa, Dragonfly Publishing, and she loved it. So it's just been moving from there.
Oh, fantastic. I love that. So they are actually from Australia, this publisher?
Yes, they're based in Perth. And they're relatively new, although my understanding is the people in it have experience with other firms, so they really know what they're doing, and they're very creative with their marketing too. They've put together these little social media ads with each of the characters and whatnot. So they're new and small and independent, but experienced and very enthusiastic, and I feel lucky to have found them. And they totally get the book. They totally get the book, which I really like.
I could see potentially the hashtags and even some of the parody of the parody on social media of the hate story, right? It's just this intercontextual. Is that real, or is this a character from the book doing? I don't know. I can imagine you're going to be having some fun with publicity for this book, especially using social media.
I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the book launch you have. So you have this virtual book launch on March 19th, 2022. Tell us a little bit about it, and you've got it's very multi-dimensional too, right?
Oh yeah, we're going to have guest readers. Like I said, guest readers and performers. Actually, 2 musicians and 7 readers doing 5-minute sets or 2 songs. And 3 of them are local friends of mine. Heather Babcock, the author of Filthy Sugar, you might have heard of her. And Mike Bryant, aka Craig Get Not Stirred, is going to do a couple of songs, and my friend Timothy Carter, who's done some YA novels. So 3, but we're also going to have Special K, who's a fantastic performance poet from Richmond, Virginia. We're going to have a few writers and musicians from the UK, and my friend Skylar from Australia, and Kelly Van Nelson, who's another best-selling poet in Australia, is going to do a brief set as well. And I'm going to be reading from the book, of course. And I believe there's going to be a movie quiz because there are a lot of movie references in the book. So we're going to have that as kind of a theme. Wow. And we haven't quite decided how we're going to do that yet, but there's plenty of time for us to organize that. And I believe there's also going to be a Q&A, and I'm hoping it's just going to be really loose and relaxed and casual and a fun time.
Sounds like a Wayne and Schuster variety hour or something like that.
Maybe, you know, with better jokes, I hope.
You got music, you've got quizzes, you've got performances. This sounds like it's going to be a really, really fun time, and anyone can attend this.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally public. You can find it on Facebook. Just search events for global launch of Hate Story, March 19th. I presume the Zoom link is going to be posted there closer to the date.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so as we get close to wrapping up, can you share with writers out there any advice that you would offer for people who are interested in writing satire or doing spoken word art in general, whether it's poetry or other spoken word? Any advice that you would offer budding writers interested in learning more about this?
I guess I would just say just keep doing it. And even if people tell you you're not very good yet, or you think you're not very good yet, you can still get better. It's a skill. Like anything else, it's a skill that you get better the more you do it. If you have stage fright, you can get over that pretty quickly. I mean, the key to that is just not care too much what the audience thinks. And I think that's important for humor as well. You know, like the best comedians, they don't want to be liked, or at least they don't betray that they want to be liked. So don't worry too much what the audience thinks. Do what's right for you. And yeah, for satire, just whatever makes you angry or whatever makes you insecure, put that into a poem or into a book. That's the best way to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Jeff, for my listeners to find out more about you, where can they go online to learn more about Jeff?
I have a website at jeffcottrill.com. That's jeffcottrill.com, and that's got MP3s and a few videos and a few interviews and podcasts like this one. I can be found easily on Twitter and Facebook, and I have some work in progress short fiction at wattpad.com as well.
Oh, cool. Oh, so you are using Wattpad to sort of experiment with some other stuff to gauge the audience?
A little bit. I think I only have like a few followers, and I haven't used it as much as a lot of other people do, but I have posted work in progress short stories on my page there, and promoted them on Facebook and Twitter. So yeah, so there's that.
Awesome. And any other projects that you're working on? You mentioned you've got some short stories. Are there any other book length works that are in the works?
I would really like to do a short story collection at some point, but I've got to maybe talk with Dragonfly about that in the future or whatever, see what they think. And I have the first 35 or 40 pages of a second novel that I just have trouble finding time to get back to because of this book and trying to get people interested in this book. And also the day job gets in the way, of course. That always gets in the way. Plus, I'm still doing the spoken word thing. So I'm hoping at some point this year to find time to work on the second novel.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and all best wishes with the forthcoming book launch.
Thank you so much. I hope to see you there.
There's a couple things I wanted to reflect on related to the conversation I had with Jeff, and the first one is the power of performance. Spoken word poetry or spoken word art. It's something that all writers can learn from. Great if you get a chance to go to an open mic if they're holding things like that, so you can kind of see the difference between reading your book and performing your book and actually giving them something entertaining. I've seen a handful of really amazing readings over time, and they don't have to be dramatic readings. They just have to be more than just the author blandly reading. So I think that's always an important thing. So, learning from artists like Jeff would be fantastic for your own author reading business, because every once in a while you may be required to do a reading. There's so much to get into in terms of how saying the wrong thing can completely destroy a person. I mean, we could talk about that for hours, but I wanted to instead focus on something that I pulled out of the conversation when Jeff talked about coming up with the idea for Hate Story, which had a completely different title, 2007, 2008. And, either lacking the confidence or it just wasn't sitting right. He had the idea, he wanted to work on it, he started working on it, but it wasn't ready for it. It was like 10 years later that he was ready for it. He took the same idea and he made something with it that's being published by a publisher from the other side of the world. And he's doing a virtual book launch, and he spent in the last couple of years doing a lot of virtual events because of the pandemic. And I just think about, he had the idea 10 years ago. He wasn't ready to write that idea. He was ready 10 years later, and he had, took the skeleton of that and wrote it and published it because he was ready for it. And maybe the world was ready for it. Maybe even some of the circumstances that made the book work better were ready for it. And that's something that we can do in our own writing careers. I mean, I've certainly done that where I've started books that I didn't finish right away. For example, I think it was 2016 when A Canadian Werewolf in New York was first published. And so it was the very next NaNoWriMo. I thought, I think I'd write a sequel. I'll call it Fear and Longing in Los Angeles. And I only got about 30, maybe 50. I think I did get 50,000 words. I threw out a lot of them. Probably 30,000 good words that I had written for that in 2017. But it wasn't until 2020, early 2021, that I was ready to write Fear and Longing in Los Angeles. Wasn't ready 3-4 years earlier. Just like Jeff wasn't ready to take the idea he had that became Hate Story, because again, he had a different title for it 10 years later. So sometimes you have the right idea at the wrong time. And that's okay. That's what we do as writers. It's a long-term game. This isn't just a short-term thing. So you're going to have ideas that you're going to try and they may not work. You can put them aside. And maybe you get back to them, maybe you don't. But that's just part of the process. And I'm always fascinated to hear stories like that. So that's it for this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to support this podcast, if you like what you're listening to, feel free to share it with a friend that you think would find value in it. You can also leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice. So those are just two of the ways that you can help spread the love and share the Stark Reflections podcast. So thanks again for listening. And so until next week and next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com. The sound of one man screaming. A pen is lifted from a cup that waits patiently on the edge of the desk. Sometimes in haste, sometimes with measured care. The pen is lifted, perched between 3 fingers, and brought down to kiss an empty page. A blank computer screen glares, the incessant whirring of a hard drive fan, an undying, steady, rhythmic pulse. Both mocking the absence of activity in the room, until the distinct sound of fingers clacking the keyboard announced the presence of words on the screen. The coffee mug is filled with a simple black blend, sometimes full, sometimes cool, often touched merely for the comfort it offers, and it overlooks the entire process. If you listen very carefully, you will hear more silent than the sound of the steam rising off the coffee, ever so gently, the sound of one man screaming. I couldn't resist. I wanted to read my poem, The Sound of One Man Screaming, which is in my 2004 short story collection, One Hand Screaming. Because I thought, why not, do a little practice and share with you that sound, because sometimes when I'm writing, it's really just screams onto the paper. Thanks for listening.